The colony world of Vareth 9 was burning. Smoke climbed into the orange sky in thick black towers, and the sound of weapons fire had not stopped for 3 full days. Not once, not even for a breath, since the Keth Dominion dropped their first soldiers onto the ground and started their march through every settlement they could find. The Keth were not a small power. They were the largest military force in the known galaxy, and they had never, in 4,000 years of recorded war, lost a campaign they chose to start. But that morning, on a long rocky ridge that ran above the valley where the last evacuation transport was parked and waiting to lift off, one man was still standing. His name was Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale. He was not a tall man, not the kind of soldier that stories usually pick, and he had a broken arm held tight against his chest, with strips torn from his own jacket, and dried blood on the side of his face from a cut above his ear that had not fully closed, and boots that had not come off his feet in 6 days, and eyes that were red from smoke and no sleep. He had a rifle in his good hand and 3 magazines left, and a short blade on his belt, and that was everything he had. His unit was gone, not retreated, gone. 12 soldiers who had been with him since the Keth first landed, and all 12 of them were now somewhere down the slope behind him, where the fighting had been worst, and he had no way to help them anymore. But the transport needed 11 more hours to finish loading the last of the civilians from the valley, and someone had to hold the ridge. So Marcus Hale held the ridge. The Keth sent their first group up the slope 2 hours after dawn. 14 soldiers in full combat armor with weapons that could punch through the side of a vehicle. And Marcus Hale shot 7 of them before they reached the halfway point, and the rest fell back. That surprised the Keth field commander, a broad, gray-skinned officer named Vrathkul, who had run 40 campaigns and never seen anything confuse him, because single soldiers did not hold ground against 14. That was not a thing that happened in any war he had studied or fought in. He sent 20 soldiers the next time. Marcus Hale did not move from the ridge. He shifted position, used the rocks well, made them think he was in 3 places at once. And when the smoke from a burning equipment crate rolled across the slope at just the right moment, he moved fast and cut their line in half before they understood what was happening. 9 Keth soldiers made it back down. 11 did not. Vrathkul stood at the base of the slope and looked up at the ridge for a long time. His second officer, a younger soldier named Jeeth, came up beside him and asked what the scan readings showed about the defending force. 1 life form, Vrathkul said. Jeeth looked at him and then looked at the slope and then looked at him again. 1, Vrathkul said again, because he understood why it was hard to believe. High above the valley, and above the ridge, and above the smoke, a ship was watching. The Velthari royal vessel, called Eternal Patience, had arrived at Vareth 9 3 hours before dawn, carrying Princess Queen Serath Valun of the Velthari sovereignty on a diplomatic mission to ask the Keth Dominion for a ceasefire before the outer systems were fully destroyed. Serath was not a soldier. She was a queen, and a young one at that, 26 years old, with silver gold hair and pale blue eyes, and a way of holding her shoulders that made every room she entered feel like it was being assessed. And she had learned from birth that power was a thing you held carefully, or it cut you. She stood at the long-range observation panel on the bridge of her ship and watched the ridge below. Her chief advisor, an old Velthari male named Korath, stood beside her with his hands folded behind his back, and said nothing for a long time. The scan panel showed 1 human life form on the ridge, moving, always moving, and the Keth forces massing at the base for a 3rd attempt. He has been up there alone for 9 hours, one of her bridge crew said quietly. Serath did not answer, watching the way the human moved across the rocks, the way he never seemed to panic, never seemed to hurry more than was needed, never made a move that did not have a clear reason behind it. She had seen soldiers before. Her sovereignty had a strong military, but she had never seen anything that looked quite like this. The 3rd Keth push came with 40 soldiers and 2 armored crawlers. Marcus Hale saw the crawlers coming and he made a decision fast. He could not stop machines with a rifle, so he did not try to stop them. Instead, he went sideways along the ridge to the left, away from the crawlers, and he hit the Kett soldiers on the eastern flank, where they had no crawler support and the ground was broken and hard to move across in armor. He was fast, and he was quiet, and he used the terrain the way someone uses a weapon. The rocks, the drops, the narrow channels between boulders, where armored soldiers had to go single file. And when the crawlers reached the top of the ridge, there was no one there to shoot at. The soldiers on the eastern flank had already fallen back. Vrathkul watched the crawlers sit empty on the ridge, and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, very quietly, that he wanted every soldier not currently engaged in the valley to assemble for a fourth push, not to capture the ridge, just to keep the human too busy to think. Jeeth asked why. Because, Vrathkul said, he was beginning to understand that this one was thinking more than they were, and that needed to stop. On the ship above, Serath watched the fourth push begin, 60 soldiers this time, coming up 3 sides of the ridge at once, and she watched the single life form on the scan panel move and shift and hold for 2 more hours, before the transport in the valley below finally lifted off with its full load of civilians safe inside. Then the life form on the scan panel stopped moving fast and started moving slow. He walked down the slope. He walked straight down the middle of the slope toward the Kett soldiers, with his rifle held up and out to his side. Out. The universal sign that said he was done fighting. The Kett soldiers did not shoot him. They stopped and watched him come down, and even the ones who had been trying to kill him for 11 hours did not raise their weapons. Korath made a sound beside Serath, a small uncertain sound, and said that he had never seen a soldier surrender quite like that, like a man who had decided to stop, rather than a man who had been forced to stop. Serath was already giving the order to bring her ship down. She was going to meet this human before the Keth did anything else with him. Vrathkul was standing 10 meters from Marcus Hale when the Velthari ship descended, and he looked at the human up close for the first time, and he saw a man who was very tired and in pain, and also completely, absolutely calm, and something in that calmness made Vrathkul take a small step back without meaning to. He told his soldiers later, when they were alone, that in 40 campaigns he had faced creatures twice the size of a human, and creatures that could kill with a touch, and creatures that had no concept of dying the way most beings did. None of them had ever made him feel afraid of one. The holding room on the Velthari ship was clean and white and quiet. A room built for diplomats being transported between meetings, not for soldiers coming off of 11 hours of combat. And it had a clear barrier wall on one side that let Serath stand in the corridor and watch Marcus Hale without being in the same space as him. She had been watching him for 20 minutes before he noticed her. He had been sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall and his eyes closed. Not sleeping, she could tell from the way his breathing was too controlled for sleep. And then he opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and she felt something odd happen in her chest, a small shock of surprise, because she had not made any sound, and yet he had known she was there. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said in a flat and not unfriendly voice that he would like something to eat if that was possible. She told her attendant to bring food. Then she pulled a chair from the corridor wall and sat down facing the barrier, and looked at him properly for the first time. Up close, he was worse than she had expected. The arm was badly swollen, even through the makeshift brace, and the cut on his head had bled down into his collar and dried there, and there were burns on his left hand from something she did not want to think about. And he looked like a man who had not been warm or dry or comfortable in a long time. And yet he sat on the floor of a foreign ship's holding room and looked back at her with no particular expression. Not fear, not anger, not the desperate bright-eyed look of a captured soldier trying to figure out how to escape. Just a calm and patient look, like a man waiting for a bus. Serath was an empath, not fully, not the way some Velthari were, but enough to read the basic shape of what someone was feeling when she looked at them directly. She looked at Marcus Hale, and she read him, and what she found made her sit very still for a moment. There was no panic in him, none, not even the small background panic that every living creature carried at some level when it was caught and caged and alone among strangers. What she found instead was a vast and quiet patience. A patience so deep it felt more like geology than emotion, like something that had been laid down over years and years until it was simply part of how he was built. And underneath the patience, at the very center of him, was a thing she had no word for in her language. A kind of fixed and settled purpose. Not anger, not ambition, just a clear and permanent knowing of what he was for and what he would do. She had read soldiers before, good ones, brave ones, and they all had some fear somewhere, because fear was the thing that made living creatures respect danger. And soldiers without fear were usually soldiers who did not last long. Marcus Hale had fear somewhere, she was sure of that, but she could not find it from where she was sitting. She asked him his name and rank, and he told her. She asked him why he had held that ridge alone, and he said, because someone had to, and the transport needed time, and there was no one else left. She asked him if he had known he might die up there. He said he had known it was more likely than not. She asked him if that had changed anything for him. He thought about it for a moment, a real pause, not a performed one, and then he said no, it had not changed anything, because the people on that transport needed to get off the ground, and that was what mattered. Sareth was quiet for a while after that. The food came and she had it pass through the barrier, and he ate it without rushing and without talking. And when he was done, he set the container aside carefully. Then he asked her what was going on. Not in a demanding way, just a direct and simple question from a man who had been grabbed off a battlefield and put on a foreign ship and wanted to understand his situation. She told him about the Keth Dominion's ultimatum, that the outer systems of the Velthari sovereignty and several smaller allied nations had 30 days to formally surrender or face total military destruction, and that she had been on her way to attempt ceasefire negotiations when Vareth 9 happened. She told him that every other species the Keth had issued this ultimatum to had capitulated within 2 weeks. Marcus Hale listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked if he could see the star charts of the affected systems. She told him no. He was technically a prisoner guest, and she was not going to hand military intelligence to a foreign soldier she had known for 40 minutes. He nodded like that was completely reasonable, and said nothing more about it. And then, over the next hour, while they talked about other things, the Keth's military history, the layout of the outer systems, the travel times between certain planets, she noticed that he was doing something with his eyes. Every time the ship changed course, even slightly, which she would not have noticed if she were not watching for it, he would track the shift in the light through the small ventilation window at the top of the room. And every time the engines changed pitch, by even a fraction, he would go still for just a second and listen. After the second hour, she asked him to describe the current location of the ship. He was quiet for a moment, and then he named a region of space, not with their star charts, but with his own military navigation terms, and it was within 2 light minutes of correct. Her chief advisor Korath, who had come to stand behind her at some point without her noticing, said very quietly close to her ear that perhaps they had made a mistake putting this one in a cage. Sarath did not answer Korath. She was looking at Marcus Hale and thinking about the way he had walked down that slope, not stumbling, not falling, not begging, just walking, like a man who had finished what he came to do and was simply moving on to what came next. She asked him what humanity would do if the Keth issued the same ultimatum to Earth. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very simply, and without any drama in his voice at all, that humans would fight. She asked him, even knowing they might lose. He said especially knowing they might lose, because that was when it mattered most. because you only found out what something was really made of when the odds were against it. He looked at her steadily and said that the Keth had been winning so long they had probably forgotten what it felt like to face something that would not stop, and that forgetting was a weakness whether they knew it or not. Seraph sat with that for a long time. Outside the ship, the stars moved past in the dark, and the Keth Dominion was somewhere ahead of them, and 30 worlds were waiting to find out whether they would surrender or be destroyed. She stood up finally and told Marcus Hale that she was going to have his arm looked at properly. He said thank you. She walked back down the corridor, and she was thinking very hard, and she did not say anything to Korath until they were around the corner. Then she said, quietly, that she wanted him moved out of the holding room. Korath asked where. She said guest quarters, proper ones, with a window. Korath was quiet for a moment, and then said that was a significant change of status. Serath said she was aware of that. She said that a man who could navigate by engine sound and gravity shift through the hull of a ship he had never been on before was not a prisoner, he was a resource, and she intended to use him carefully. The Velthari High Court was a vast open chamber, carved from white stone and gold light, a room that had been built to make everyone who entered it feel very small and very aware of how much history had happened in that exact place. And it did that job well. 22 council members sat in a curved row of tall-backed seats, and behind them in the gallery were ambassadors and advisors and observers from 11 different species. All of them there because the Keth ultimatum had reached every corner of the outer galaxy, and every living nation had sent someone to watch what the Velthari would do. Marcus Hales sat in a chair off to the side of the main floor. Not at the table, not in the gallery, just off to the side, like a piece of furniture someone had put there and forgotten about. His arm was in a proper cast now, white and clean against his patched uniform, and the cut on his head had been closed properly, and he had slept for 9 hours in the guest quarters Serath had given him, and eaten 2 full meals, and was, by his own estimation, about 70% of the way back to functional. He sat in his chair and listened to the council debate. The debate had been going for 2 hours, and it had covered surrender terms, military strength, historical precedents, the fate of 11 other species who had already capitulated, economic projections, the suffering of civilians in a prolonged war, and the very real possibility that resistance would simply mean the Keth destroyed them faster. It was a thorough and intelligent debate, and it was going absolutely nowhere. The council was split almost exactly in half for accepting the Keth's terms with conditions, half for resisting with the hope of building a coalition. And every argument each side made was good enough that the other side could not fully dismiss it, which meant the debate kept turning in circles. After 2 hours, the council chair asked if anyone in the chamber wished to speak who had not yet spoken. Marcus Hale raised his hand. There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when something unexpected occurs in a very formal room. And the council chair looked at Serath, who was seated at the end of the council row, and Serath gave a small nod. Chair said the human could speak. Marcus Hale stood up and walked to the center of the floor, and stood there for a moment and looked at the 22 council members one by one. Not in a challenging way, just in the way of someone who wanted to actually see the people he was talking to. Then he said he had one question. He asked how many of them had children. It was not the question anyone had expected. After a moment, most of the hands in the room went up, or the equivalent of hands, since several of the species present used other gestures. And Marcus Hale looked at all of them and nodded slowly. Then he said, "Then you already know the answer to the question you have been debating for 2 hours." He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he said that he was not going to tell them what to do because it was not his world and not his war, and he had no authority here. But he was going to tell them what he saw from where he was standing. He said that the Keth Dominion had won every war they had ever started. And the reason they had won every war was not because they were stronger than everyone, though they were strong. It was because every species they had ever faced had believed at some point that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of surrender. And every time a species surrendered, the Keth learned that lesson again. That the threat of destruction was enough. That they did not actually have to destroy anyone, they just had to make the threat real enough. He said the Keth were not actually unbeatable. They just had never fought anyone who refused to believe that. He said he was not asking them to be brave. Bravery was something people felt for a moment. He was asking them to be decided, which was something different, which was something that lasted. Then he sat back down. The chamber was very quiet. One of the older council members, a woman named Vel'Thas, who had been on the council for 40 years and had seen 3 wars and was not easily moved, said carefully that this was a fine sentiment, but sentiment did not stop Keth warships. Marcus Hale said she was right, and asked if he could use the display table. Sareth said yes. He walked to the display table in the center of the floor, and he spent 4 minutes pulling up maps and transit routes and supply chain data and resource flowcharts, things that were publicly available in the Velthari military archives, nothing classified. And then he started talking. Not about bravery, about logistics. He talked about the Keth supply lines, and how long they were, and how many refueling stations they depended on, and where those stations were relative to the systems the Velthari controlled. And he talked about how a military that was used to fast, decisive victories had never had to maintain a long campaign against a force that simply refused to be finished. And he talked about what happened to morale in an army that expected to win quickly, and instead found itself still fighting a year later. He talked about terrain, not just physical terrain, but political terrain, the relationships between the outer systems and the smaller species who had already surrendered, and who might, given the right approach, be willing to cause problems for the Keth from within. He talked about how humans had invented a kind of warfare called attrition a very long time ago, and had been practicing it ever since, and how attrition was not about winning any single battle, but about making the cost of continuing a war higher than the cost of ending it. He talked for 40 minutes, and he used simple words and clear numbers, and he did not exaggerate anything. When he finished, Vel'Thas sat very still for a moment, and then said that he had described a strategy that would take years and cause enormous suffering. Marcus Hale said yes. She said it might still fail. He said yes, it might. She asked why that was better than surrender. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that surrender was also not painless. It was just a different kind of pain, the kind that got quieter over time and easier to ignore, but that it did not go away, and that the children of people who surrendered grew up in a world shaped by that choice, and they would know it, and it would be in them whether they wanted it to be or not. He said he could not tell them which kind of pain to choose. He said that was their decision. The council voted 3 hours later. 12 for resistance, 9 for surrender, 1 abstention. It was not a large majority, but it was a majority. After the session ended, the Keth ambassador, a thin, silver-scaled official named Dreth Voss, who had been sitting in the observer gallery the whole time, came down to the main floor to deliver a formal demand that the human be arrested and handed over as a foreign combatant who had interfered in diplomatic proceedings. Marcus Hale was already standing on the main floor when Dreth Voss approached. He did not say anything. He just looked at the Keth ambassador. He stood still and looked at him with the same calm and settled expression he had worn in the holding cell and on the ridge, and in every moment since Sareth had first seen him. That look of a man who was not afraid, and was not angry, and was simply and completely present. Dreth Voss stopped walking toward him. He stood there for a moment, and then another moment, and then he said the formal demand again, in a louder voice, to the room. Marcus Hale kept looking at him. Dreth Voss turned and walked out. He had not done anything, had not moved, had not spoken, had not threatened, and the Keth ambassador had left. Sareth watched from the doorway, and Korath was beside her. And Korath said very quietly that Dreth Voss had filed 40 diplomatic complaints in his career, and had never once walked away from a confrontation first. Sareth said nothing. She was watching Marcus Hale stand alone in the center of the great white chamber, and she was thinking that the galaxy had been afraid of the Keth for 4,000 years. and now she was beginning to understand what it felt like to be afraid of something else. Marcus Hale had no rank in the Velthari military. No title, no badge, no official place in any chain of command. And he made it very clear from the beginning that he was not looking for any of those things. He was, on paper, a guest, a foreign soldier on extended leave from his own military, while the situation was reviewed by Earth's government, which had sent exactly one message to the Velthari sovereignty that said, in careful diplomatic language, that they were aware of where Sergeant Hale was and would appreciate updates, and that they trusted he was conducting himself with appropriate professionalism. Seraph had read that message 3 times and found it quietly extraordinary. That Earth's government, upon learning one of their soldiers had ended up in the middle of a galactic war on a foreign queen's ship, had responded with something that amounted to, "He's one of ours, keep us posted, we're sure he's fine." She was beginning to understand that this was, in fact, exactly what humans were like. Marcus Hale operated on borrowed trust, the trust he built one conversation at a time, one correct assessment at a time, one moment of being right when everyone else was uncertain. And in 6 months of war, that currency accumulated faster than anyone had expected. The Velthari military had good soldiers, disciplined, well-trained, brave in the way that soldiers who had prepared for war their whole lives were brave. But they had been trained for the kind of war the Keth usually ran, which was fast and overwhelming and designed to end before the defending side could adapt. Marcus Hale did not teach them how to fight that war. He taught them how to fight a different one. He spent the first month not on any battlefield, but in training rooms and briefing halls, talking to small groups of officers, never large audiences, always small groups, and he did not lecture them about tactics. He talked to them about how to lose a battle and come back. He talked about what defeat felt like in the body and the mind, and how the natural response to defeat was to either freeze or to make desperate fast decisions to recover what was lost, and how both of those responses were exactly what an enemy who had just beaten you wanted you to do, and how the correct response was to treat the defeat like data. Figure out what it told you, and use that information to do better the next time. He said that on Earth, humans had been losing wars and recovering from them for so long that the recovery had become part of the process. That a human military unit that got hit hard did not crumble, it regrouped. Not because humans did not feel pain or fear or grief, but because they had decided as a species a very long time ago that those feelings did not get to make the decisions. The Velthari officers listened to him, carefully at first, skeptically, but they listened. And then the first major battle happened. It was at a system called Vorath 7, a Velthari resupply station the Keth wanted to take, because losing it would cut off 3 outer system worlds from each other. And the Keth came in with an armada that was twice the size of the Velthari Defense Force, and moving fast, expecting the station to be abandoned or surrendered before they even got into weapons range. Marcus Hale was not in command, he was never in command, but he was in the room when the defense strategy was being decided. And he said one thing. He said, "Let them think they are winning until they are too deep to turn around." The Velthari commander, a strong and experienced officer named Admiral Shora, looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at her own officers, and then started moving ships. The feint was not a complicated maneuver. It was ancient, in fact, older than most of the species in the galaxy had been spacefaring. And the Keth had no word for it in their tactical vocabulary, because no one had ever used it against them before. The Velthari Defense Force fell back, just enough, just fast enough to look like real retreat. And the Keth armada came forward, into the space the Velthari had just left. And then the ships that had been waiting on the far side of the system's outer moon came around, and the ships that had appeared to be fleeing stopped and turned, and the Keth found themselves surrounded by a force that was still smaller than theirs, but was now on all sides, instead of just ahead. Armada in 4 hours. It was the first significant military defeat the Keth Dominion had suffered in over 300 years. News of it moved across the galaxy in days. The Thuri collective sent a message to the Velthari, asking for details. Carefully worded, diplomatically cautious, but asking. The Anak Republic sent a representative to the Velthari capital with no official agenda listed, which in diplomatic language meant they had an agenda they were not ready to say out loud yet. And then something very unusual happened. The Devorn sent a message. The Devorn were the oldest known spacefaring species in the galaxy, so old that the other species spoke about them the way younger people spoke about mountains or ancient rivers. Present, permanent, not really part of the conversation of ordinary life. And they had not sent an unsolicited message to any other galactic nation in over 600 years. The message was short. It said, "We did not think any new thing existed in this universe. We were wrong. We are watching." Sareth read it in her private study with Korath standing beside her, and neither of them said anything for a full minute. The war did not get easier after Vorath 7. The Keth adapted, as large powers do, and threw more resources at the problem. But something had changed in the shape of the conflict. Other species started causing problems for the Keth from within their own surrender agreements. Small problems at first, supply delays and paperwork complications, and border disputes that needed resolution. And those problems multiplied in the way that small problems do when someone is encouraging them carefully from the outside. Marcus Hale spent those months moving, from ship to ship, from briefing to briefing, from one small group of officers to the next. And he slept wherever there was a surface to sleep on, and ate whatever was available, and never complained about either. Sareth watched him from a distance sometimes, when she could, when her own duties allowed, and she noticed that he was the same in every room, with every rank of person, in every situation. The same flat, calm voice, the same direct eyes, the same quality of attention that made whoever he was talking to feel like that most important person in the conversation. She had asked him once, late in the 3rd month, when they were eating together in the officers' mess, because neither of them had time for a proper meal, whether he ever got tired of being the smartest person in the room. He had looked genuinely surprised, and then genuinely amused, and said that he was almost never the smartest person in the room, and that the few times he was, it was usually because the room was not big enough. She had asked what he meant. He said that the value he brought was not intelligence. There were smarter people than him in any large group, but experience with a specific kind of problem that these particular people had not faced before, which was different from being smart, and which would stop being useful the moment they had the experience themselves. He said his goal was to make himself unnecessary as fast as possible. She had sat with that for a long time. In the 5th month, the Keth Dominion did something no one had expected. They offered peace terms. Real ones. Not surrender demands, not ultimatums. Actual negotiated peace terms, with concessions on both sides, offered through a neutral third party. The Anak Republics, who had by then officially joined the coalition against the Keth, brought the offer to Sareth directly. She read it alone first, and then she went to find Marcus Hale. He was in a training room with 6 Veltari officers, standing at a display table with his good arm pointing at a holographic map. And he looked up when she came in, and she nodded at him, and he said something quiet to the officers, and walked over to her. She handed him the offer without saying anything. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it was real. She asked how he could tell. He said because they had given something up on the 3rd page that they did not have to give up. Something small that most people would not notice. But when a party gives up something they did not have to give up, it means they are actually trying to reach agreement, and not just trying to look like they are. Sareth looked at him. He looked back at her with the same steady expression he always had. She said that if this was real, if the Keth were genuinely willing to negotiate, then the next step was not a military one. He said he knew. She said that meant it was her turn to do the hard part. He said yes. Then he said he would be there if she needed him. It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply, and she believed it completely. The summit was held on a station called the Meridian, a neutral platform in the space between three systems, owned by no nation and maintained by a small organization of independent diplomats who charged nothing and asked nothing, except that every party who used it kept the peace within its walls. Every major galactic power had sent someone. The Keth Dominion came with their high commander, a tall, dark-armored being named Vrath San, who had the same cold military bearing that all Keth leaders carried, and who had never in his career lost a negotiation, and 6 advisors and a full security detail. The Velthari sovereignty came with Sereth Valun, her council chair Velthas, Korath, Admiral Shora, and a full diplomatic team. The Thuri Collective, and the Anak Republics and 4 smaller species who had joined the coalition against the Keth, came with their own delegations. The Devorns sent 1 observer, a very old and very small being wrapped in gray fabric, who sat in a corner of the gallery and did not speak to anyone. Marcus Hale was not on the guest list. He showed up anyway. He walked through the Meridian's main entrance in his original uniform, the same one he had been wearing on the ridge, cleaned and repaired, but still clearly the same garment, with the rank patch and the unit insignia and the visible mend on the left sleeve where someone had stitched a tear closed. And he nodded to the security staff at the door and walked past them, and they let him through because he had the kind of walk that made people assume he was supposed to be somewhere. He found a seat in the main chamber off to the side, not at the table, not in any official position, the same way he had sat in the Velthari High Court, and he sat down and folded his hands and waited. The summit opened with 3 hours of formal statements, every delegation reading prepared remarks into the record, and Marcus Hale sat through all of it without moving or speaking. Then the real negotiation started, and it was immediately clear that it was going badly. The Keth wanted full recognition of the territories they had already taken from species who had surrendered, a condition the coalition could not accept without betraying every nation that had joined them on the promise that they were fighting for restoration, not just for themselves. The coalition wanted a full withdrawal from all occupied systems, which the Keth refused because it would mean losing face in front of every species that had watched them build their empire for 4,000 years. Both positions were reasonable from inside each side's perspective and completely incompatible with each other, and the summit was 2 hours from collapsing when Marcus Hale stood up. He was not recognized to speak. He stood up anyway and waited. Vrath San looked at him from across the table, at this one human in a patched uniform, who had no title and no nation represented here and no right to be in this room at all, and said, in a voice that was meant to be dismissive, that the human had no standing to address this summit. Marcus Hale said he understood that. He said he was not there as a representative of anything. Not Earth, not the coalition, not the Velthari sovereignty. He was there as a private individual who had been paying attention. He said he would take 2 minutes, and if anyone wanted him to stop, they could stop him. No one stopped him. He said that both sides were trying to solve the wrong problem, that the Keth needed to not lose face, and the coalition needed to not betray its members. And those were 2 real needs that were not actually in conflict with each other if you looked at them right. He said that face was not lost by giving back what you had taken. It was lost by being forced to give it back, and those were different things. He said that if the Keth chose to withdraw from the occupied systems as a demonstration of strength, as proof that they were powerful enough to hold the territory and simply chose not to, that was not defeat, that was decision, and those were very different things in front of a watching galaxy. He said that history did not remember who held which rock for which decade. History remembered what you built. He said that the Keth Dominion had been the most powerful force in the galaxy for 4,000 years, and that record was not erased by one lost campaign. But what they did next would either add to that record or start a new one. A different kind of story. He said he was not asking them to be weaker. He said he was asking them to be bigger. Then he sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Vrath San sat at the far end of the table and looked at the surface in front of him for a long time. His chief advisor leaned close and said something in a low voice, and Vrath-San did not respond. The Devoran observer in the corner of the gallery, who had not moved in 3 hours, turned its head slowly and looked at Marcus Hale. After a long silence, Vrath-San looked up and said that the Kef Dominion would consider a phased withdrawal framework. The room began to move again. It took 11 more hours of negotiation to get from that moment to a signed agreement. Real negotiations, hard ones, with genuine conflict over a dozen specific points, but the agreement was reached, and it was signed. And when the last signature was placed on the document, the chamber filled with a sound that was different in every species present, but meant the same thing in all of them. After it was done, Seraph found Marcus Hale standing near a window, looking out at the stars, and she stood beside him for a moment, without speaking. Then she told him that the Velthari sovereignty wanted to bestow on him the eternal star, the highest honor the sovereignty could give to any individual, and that it had never in the history of the sovereignty been given to someone who was not Velthari. Marcus Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was grateful, and that he would accept it. She asked him what he was going to do next. He said he wanted to go home. She asked if there was anything he needed from her before he left. He said he needed to file his after-action report. He was months overdue on it, and his commanding officer was going to have things to say about that. And he needed to return the borrowed jacket he had taken from a Velthari supply room in the 2nd month of the campaign and never returned. She looked at him. He looked back at her. She said that the jacket was his and that the report could wait. He said the report could not wait. Reports were how you made sure the people who came after you had better information than you started with, and he would not skip it. She believed him. The ceremony for the Eternal Star was held the next morning, short, because he had asked for short, and Seraph pinned the medal to his repaired jacket in front of a room of Velthari officials and foreign dignitaries, and one very old Devoran observer who stood near the back and watched everything. Marcus Hale shook every hand and thanked every person, and then asked which direction the departure bay was. His ship left the meridian at mid-morning. Seraph stood at the observation window on the upper deck and watched the human transport accelerate toward the jump point. A small ship, nothing impressive from the outside, and she watched it until it made the jump, and the space where it had been was just ordinary dark again. Korath came to stand beside her. She said, without looking away from the window, that he had changed the shape of the galaxy, and walked away asking for nothing. Korath was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, no, he had asked to go home, and that was the whole point, because a man who fights for something real always knows what he is fighting to get back to, and the going home is not the reward at the end, it is the reason from the beginning. Seraph stood at the window for a long time after Korath left. Somewhere on the other side of the jump point, on a small blue world that most of the galaxy had not been paying much attention to until very recently, a soldier was going home. And somewhere in a room that smelled like old coffee and recycled air, he was already at a whiteboard, writing things down, making sure the people who came after him would start from a better place than he had. That was what humans did. That had always been what humans did.